Welcome, we're so happy you tuned in tonight. Before we get started, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Now, let's get comfortable and drift into deep, peaceful sleep together. In the beginning, there was wonder. Long before the marble columns of Athens rose against the Mediterranean sky, long before Socrates walked the agora asking his relentless questions, humans gazed at the stars and asked why. They looked inward and questioned who. They contemplated their mortality and pondered what comes after. Philosophy was not born in a single moment or place. It emerged wherever consciousness turned upon itself, wherever the human mind refused to accept the world as simply given and demanded to understand the deeper patterns beneath the surface of things. In the ancient lands of India, wise men sat beneath banyan trees and composed hymns that would echo through millennia. The Vedas spoke of cosmic order, of sacrifice and ritual, but it was the Upanishads that pushed deeper, past ceremony and into the nature of reality itself. What is the self? What is this Atman that seems to observe our thoughts, feel our feelings, yet remains somehow separate from them? Is there a permanent essence beneath the constant flux of experience? These questions led to profound realizations, that the individual soul and the universal consciousness might be one and the same, that the material world might be less solid than it appears, that liberation from suffering could come through understanding rather than through action alone. The concept of karma emerged, not as punishment or reward, but as the inexorable law of cause and effect rippling through time. Every action creates consequences, every thought shapes future circumstances, every life connects to countless others in an intricate web of causation. And moksha, the liberation from this cycle, became the ultimate goal. Not escape from existence, but freedom from ignorance and suffering. Far to the east, in the fertile valleys of ancient China, a different voice emerged. Confucius walked from state to state during a time of chaos and warfare, teaching that the foundation of a good society rested not on force, but on virtue. He emphasized the relationships that bind humans together, parent and child, ruler and subject, friend and friend. These were not abstract principles, but practical wisdom for daily living. Respect your elders, he taught, not from blind obedience, but from recognition of their accumulated wisdom. Govern with benevolence, not tyranny. Cultivate yourself before attempting to improve others. His teachings emphasized ritual and propriety, but not as empty formalism, rather as the outward expression of inner cultivation. Meanwhile, another figure emerged from the mists of Chinese antiquity, perhaps historical, perhaps legendary. Laozi, the old master, spoke of a different path. Where Confucius emphasized social harmony through proper action, Laozi pointed toward the Tao, the way that cannot be named or fully articulated. He taught that true wisdom comes from aligning oneself with the natural flow of existence, from acting through non-action, from achieving through non-striving. The softest water wears away the hardest stone, not through force but through persistence and natural movement. Simplicity, spontaneity, and acceptance became the watchwords of this mystical philosophy that would influence millions. In Persia, Zoroaster proclaimed a universe split between light and darkness, truth and falsehood, good and evil. This dualistic vision would ripple outward, influencing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, shaping how billions would understand morality and cosmic struggle. The idea that existence itself was a battleground between opposing forces, that humans had to choose sides in this eternal conflict, became a powerful framework for understanding suffering and injustice. These Eastern traditions demonstrated that philosophy was humanity's universal project, not limited by geography or culture, but emerging wherever humans possessed the leisure and inclination to question deeply. Then, on the shores of Ionia, in the Greek colonies of Asia Minor, something remarkable occurred. Men began to look at the natural world and ask not what gods controlled it, but what fundamental substance composed it. Thales of Miletus, standing by the sea, proposed that water was the primary element, the source from which all things arose and to which all things returned. It seemed reasonable. Water could be solid ice, flowing liquid, or invisible vapour. It was essential for life. Perhaps everything was simply water in different forms. Anaximenes suggested air instead, noting how breath was synonymous with life itself. But Heraclitus looked deeper and saw not substance but process. Everything flows, he declared. You cannot step into the same river twice, because new waters are constantly flowing in. The river seems permanent, but it is actually ceaseless change. Fire became his symbol, not as a substance but as transformation itself, the constant flux that underlies all apparent stability. Identity is an illusion. Becoming is the only reality. Parmenides vehemently disagreed. Change itself is impossible, he argued through rigorous logical reasoning. Being is. Non-being is not and cannot be. How can something change from one state to another? The intermediate state would be neither the first nor the second, a logical impossibility. Therefore, change must be an illusion created by our deceptive senses. True reality is eternal, unchanging, and one. The apparent multiplicity and motion of the world is mere appearance, a veil over the unchanging truth of being. Pythagoras added another voice, claiming that numbers held the secret to reality. Mathematical relationships governed the cosmos, the harmonies of music, the movements of celestial bodies, the proportions of beauty. Understanding mathematics meant understanding the deep structure of existence. These pre-Socratic thinkers, each proposing their own vision of reality's foundation, moved human thought from mythology to philosophy, from stories about gods to rational arguments about the nature of things. Then came the Golden Age, centered in Athens, where democracy and philosophy flourished together. Socrates walked the marketplace, dishevelled and provocative, approaching the confident and powerful with deceptively simple questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is virtue? At first his interlocutors would offer quick answers, certain of their understanding. But through careful questioning, Socrates would reveal contradictions, expose unexamined assumptions, demonstrate that what seemed clear was actually confused. He claimed no wisdom himself except the recognition of his own ignorance, and this, he insisted, made him wiser than those who thought they knew but did not. The unexamined life is not worth living, he proclaimed at his trial. Even facing death, he refused to stop questioning, refused to accept conventional answers without scrutiny. His method, the dialectic, the back and forth of question and answer, became a model for philosophical investigation that endures to this day. Plato, Socrates' devoted student, was devastated by his master's execution. How could a just man be killed by a democratic government? How could the pursuit of truth be punished by society? Plato's answer reshaped philosophy. The material world, he concluded, was merely a shadow of true reality. Perfect forms existed in an eternal realm, the form of justice, the form of beauty, the form of the good. These were not mere concepts, but genuine realities, more real than any physical object. A beautiful painting was beautiful only because it participated imperfectly in the eternal form of beauty. A just action was just only because it reflected the form of justice. Plato's allegory of the cave illustrated this dramatically. Humans are like prisoners chained in a cave, watching shadows on the wall and mistaking them for reality. The philosopher is the one who breaks free, climbs out into the sunlight, sees the true world of forms, and returns, usually unwelcome, to tell others what he has discovered. This vision of two worlds, one material and imperfect, one eternal and perfect, would influence Western thought for thousands of years. Aristotle, Plato's student, loved his teacher but disagreed fundamentally. Forms do not exist in some separate realm, he argued, but are embedded in the things themselves. To understand justice, study just actions. To understand life, observe living organisms. Aristotle was perhaps the first great scientist-philosopher, meticulously observing and classifying the natural world, from politics to biology, from ethics to poetry. His ethical theory centered on eudaimonia, human flourishing, achieved through virtue. But virtue, he taught, is not following rigid rules. It is finding the golden mean between extremes. Courage lies between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lies between stinginess and wastefulness. Wisdom involves knowing which extreme to avoid in which circumstance. Aristotle's influence was so profound that for centuries, the philosopher meant Aristotle and no other. His logic, his categories, his methods shaped how the West thought about everything. As the Greek city-states declined and vast empires rose, philosophy changed its focus from understanding reality to surviving it. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium, taught that virtue was sufficient for happiness. External circumstances, wealth, health, reputation, were indifferents, neither good nor bad in themselves. What mattered was maintaining tranquility through self-control and acceptance of fate. The universe operates according to logos, divine reason, they taught. Everything happens for a reason within a rational cosmic order. Resisting this order creates suffering. Accepting it brings peace. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, wrote his meditations in the camps of war, reminding himself that all is transient, that death comes to all, that only virtue has lasting value. Epicurus offered a different path to peace. Pleasure is the highest good, he declared, but not the pleasure of indulgence. True pleasure comes from freedom from pain and freedom from fear, especially the fear of death and divine punishment. The gods, if they exist, are indifferent to human affairs. Death is simply cessation. When we are, death is not. When death is, we are not. Why fear what cannot touch us? Epicurus recommended a simple life, good friends, and freedom from politics and striving. His garden in Athens became a sanctuary where followers lived modestly and philosophized about how to eliminate unnecessary desires and achieve ataraxia, undisturbed tranquility. The skeptics, led by Pyrrho, took questioning to its logical extreme. Every claim can be doubted, every argument challenged. For every reason to believe something, there is an equal and opposite reason to doubt it. Therefore, suspend judgment entirely. This suspension of judgment, they claimed, paradoxically led to peace. The dogmatists, whether Stoic or Epicurean, suffered from defending their positions and arguing with opponents. The skeptic, committed to nothing, troubled by nothing, floated above such conflicts. These Hellenistic schools made philosophy practical, transforming it from abstract speculation into therapeutic wisdom for navigating life's difficulties. As the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, philosophy became the handmaiden of theology. Augustine of Hippo, a former Manichaean who converted dramatically, brought Platonic philosophy into Christian thought. He wrestled with the problem of evil. If God is all good and all-powerful, why does evil exist? His answer: evil is not a thing but an absence, a privation of good. Humans possess free will, and our misuse of this freedom creates evil. True happiness cannot be found in this world, Augustine taught, only in union with God in the eternal city of heaven. The earthly city, mired in sin and selfishness, was at best a temporary way station. Centuries later, Thomas Aquinas performed a similar synthesis with Aristotle. Where Augustine had married Plato to Christianity, Aquinas joined Aristotle to faith. Reason and revelation, he argued, cannot truly conflict because both come from God. Natural theology could demonstrate God's existence through rational argument. His 5 ways included the argument from motion, from causation, from contingency, from degrees of perfection, and from design. But beyond what reason could prove, faith provided additional truths through scripture and church tradition. Aquinas created an intricate philosophical edifice that dominated Catholic thought and influenced all of Western philosophy. Meanwhile, Islamic civilization preserved and advanced philosophy when Europe had largely forgotten it. Avicenna in Persia wrote voluminously on metaphysics, distinguishing between essence and existence, arguing that existence was a perfection added to essence by God. His floating man thought experiment asked, if you were suspended in air, unable to sense your body or surroundings, would you still know that you exist? This anticipates Descartes' cogito by centuries. Averroes in Spain wrote comprehensive commentaries on Aristotle that became standard texts, arguing for the harmony of reason and revelation while maintaining their distinct spheres. In Jewish thought, Maimonides attempted to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Torah, writing his guide for the perplexed to help educated Jews navigate between faith and reason. These medieval philosophers ensured that the Greek heritage survived and developed, eventually flowing back into European thought during the Renaissance. The Renaissance brought a rebirth of classical learning and a celebration of human potential. Humanism placed humanity at the centre of concern. Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man proclaimed that humans alone among creatures could shape their own nature. We are not fixed like animals. We can become beast-like through vice, or godlike through virtue. This dignity carries responsibility. We must cultivate ourselves, develop our reason, realise our potential. Erasmus promoted education, tolerance, and the reform of Christianity through scholarship rather than through violence. The Renaissance was less about systematic philosophy than about recovering ancient wisdom and applying it to human flourishing. Then came the great revolution in thought called the Enlightenment. René Descartes, sitting in a stove-heated room in Germany, decided to doubt everything he could possibly doubt. Perhaps his senses deceived him. Perhaps an evil demon manipulated his thoughts. But one thing remained indubitable. The very fact that he was thinking proved that he existed. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. From this foundation of certainty, Descartes attempted to rebuild knowledge using reason alone. His method of doubt and his emphasis on clear and distinct ideas shaped how philosophy would proceed. Rationalism claimed that reason, not experience, was the primary source of knowledge. Baruch Spinoza, a lens grinder in Amsterdam, took this rationalism to radical conclusions. There is only one substance, he argued, God or nature. Everything that exists is a modification of this single substance. Humans are not separate souls, but finite modes of the infinite. Free will is an illusion. Everything follows necessarily from the nature of God. This deterministic vision, which equated God with nature and denied personal immortality, got Spinoza excommunicated from the Jewish community and reviled by Christians. Yet his ethics, written in geometric form with axioms and proofs, presented a vision of peace through understanding our place in the cosmic order. Gottfried Leibniz offered a more optimistic rationalism. This is the best of all possible worlds, he claimed, not because it contains no evil, but because God, in his infinite wisdom, chose the optimal balance of good over evil from among infinite possible worlds. Leibniz's metaphysics proposed countless monads, simple substances without parts, each reflecting the entire universe from its unique perspective. His principle of sufficient reason stated that nothing happens without a reason, even if we cannot discern it. Against the rationalists stood the empiricists, who insisted that all knowledge comes from experience. John Locke argued that the mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, written upon by sensory experience. There are no innate ideas, only the ideas we build from sensations and reflections upon those sensations. Locke's political philosophy was equally influential. Government exists by consent of the governed, and when government violates natural rights to life, liberty and property, revolution becomes justified. David Hume pushed empiricism to sceptical conclusions. We never observe causation itself, only constant conjunction, event A reliably followed by event B. We infer causation from habit, but this inference lacks rational justification. Similarly, we never observe a self, only a bundle of constantly changing perceptions. The self is a fiction created by memory and resemblance. Hume's sceptical arguments about induction, causation, and identity shook philosophy to its foundations. Immanuel Kant claimed that Hume's skepticism awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. In his critique of pure reason, Kant attempted to transcend the rationalist-empiricist divide. We cannot know things as they are in themselves, he argued, only as they appear to us. But appearances are not arbitrary. Our minds structure experience through innate categories like causality, substance, and unity. Space and time are not features of reality itself, but forms of our intuition, the way we necessarily perceive things. Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy made the mind active rather than passive, shaping reality rather than merely receiving it. His moral philosophy was equally revolutionary. Act only according to maxims you could will to become universal laws. Treat humanity always as an end, never merely as a means. Morality comes from reason and autonomy, not from divine command or consequences. The Enlightenment's political philosophy transformed nations. Montesquieu analysed forms of government and advocated for separation of powers, executive, legislative and judicial, as protection against tyranny. Rousseau proclaimed that man is born free, but is everywhere in chains, arguing that legitimate government must rest on a social contract embodying the general will. Voltaire championed freedom of thought and speech, opposing religious fanaticism and political oppression with wit and reason. These ideas fueled the American and French revolutions, reshaping the political landscape. The 19th century brought sweeping, systematic philosophies. Hegel described reality as spirit realizing itself through history in a dialectical process. Thesis encounters, antithesis, producing synthesis, which becomes a new thesis. History was the march of freedom, each age advancing beyond the contradictions of the previous age. The rational is real, and the real is rational. History has a purpose and direction. Karl Marx took Hegel's dialectics but flipped it. Material conditions, not ideas, drive history. The economic base determines the ideological superstructure. History is the story of class struggle, and capitalism contains contradictions that will inevitably lead to its overthrow and replacement by communism. Philosophy should not merely interpret the world, but change it. Marx's thought would shape the 20th century more than perhaps any other philosophers, for better and worse. Søren Kierkegaard rejected Hegel's system entirely. Abstract philosophy misses what matters most: the existing individual facing anxiety, despair, and the need for authentic choice. Kierkegaard distinguished between aesthetic life, seeking pleasure, ethical life, following duty, and religious life, the leap of faith toward God. Truth is subjectivity. What matters is not objective knowledge but passionate commitment. His existential emphasis on the individual's radical freedom and responsibility influenced 20th century thought profoundly. Arthur Schopenhauer painted a darker picture. Behind the world of representation lies the thing in itself, which Kant said we could not know. Schopenhauer claimed to have discovered it: blind, irrational will, constantly striving without purpose or satisfaction. Life is suffering because will can never be satisfied. Temporary cessation of willing brings aesthetic contemplation, art's purpose. Permanent cessation requires asceticism and denial of the will to live. Friedrich Nietzsche went further. God is dead, he proclaimed, not as atheist triumphalism, but as diagnosis of European nihilism. Without divine foundation, traditional morality collapses, but this is opportunity, not catastrophe. We must revalue all values, transcend the slave morality of Christianity that glorifies weakness, and embrace a master morality that affirms life, power, and creativity. The Übermensch, the overhuman, is not a biological evolution, but a spiritual overcoming, the person who creates their own values and lives authentically beyond resentment and herd conformity. The will to power drives all existence, not as domination, but as growth, overcoming, creation. The 20th century splintered philosophy into multiple schools. Analytic philosophy, beginning with Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, emphasized logical rigor and clarity. Ludwig Wittgenstein's early work attempted to show the logical structure of language and reality. His later philosophy took a different turn. Meaning comes from use, not from reference to objects or mental states. Philosophy's task is dissolving confusions created by misunderstanding how language actually works. Phenomenology, founded by Edmund Husserl, sought to describe consciousness rigorously. Bracket metaphysical assumptions and examine experience as it appears. Martin Heidegger, Husserl's student, asked the question of being. What does it mean for something to be? Humans are Dasein, being there, thrown into a world not of our choosing yet responsible for creating meaning through our choices. Authenticity requires confronting our mortality and choosing to live genuinely rather than losing ourselves in the they, the anonymous crowd. Existentialism flourished after World War II. Jean-Paul Sartre proclaimed that existence precedes essence. Humans are condemned to be free, radically responsible for creating their own nature through choices. Bad faith is deceiving ourselves about this freedom, pretending we have no choice when we do. His partner Simone de Beauvoir applied existentialism to gender, arguing that one is not born, but rather becomes, a woman. Gender is performed and constructed, not simply given. Albert Camus confronted the absurd, the conflict between our desire for meaning and the universe's silence. Suicide is rejecting the absurd. Faith is escaping it. The authentic response is revolt, embracing life passionately despite its meaninglessness, like Sisyphus eternally pushing his boulder, whom we must imagine happy. American pragmatism, developed by William James and John Dewey, rejected abstract metaphysics. Truth is what works in practice. Ideas are instruments for dealing with reality, not pictures of eternal essences. Democracy is not just a political system, but a way of life requiring education, experimentation, and continuous growth. James defended religious faith not on dogmatic grounds, but because religious beliefs can be pragmatically justified for those who find them meaningful. Postmodern philosophy deconstructed traditional certainties. Michel Foucault analysed how power and knowledge intertwine, how institutions like prisons, hospitals and schools create and regulate subjects. Truth is not neutral, but produced within power relations. Jacques Derrida deconstructed binary oppositions, showing how each term depends on its opposite, how meaning is unstable, always deferred. Jean-François Lyotard declared incredulity toward meta-narratives, suspicion of grand stories claiming to explain everything. Today, philosophy has become truly global. African philosophy, long dismissed by Western academics, articulates communal values, Ubuntu ethics, and distinctive epistemologies. Indigenous philosophies offer alternatives to Western individualism and dualism, emphasizing relationality and respect for nature. Feminist philosophy continues revealing how supposedly neutral reasoning often embeds male perspectives. Philosophy addresses artificial intelligence ethics, climate change, genetic engineering, identity, justice, inequality. It remains alive not as a settled body of truths, but as ongoing conversation, multiple voices engaged in humanity's oldest project, understanding ourselves and our world. The journey through philosophy reveals no final answers, only better questions. From ancient sages to contemporary thinkers, from Athens to Beijing to Nairobi, humans have sought wisdom through reason, intuition, experience, and dialogue. Philosophy shows us that certainty is elusive but understanding is possible, that we stand on the shoulders of those who question before us, and that the unexamined life remains, as Socrates insisted, not worth living. Yet this is not where the story ends, for philosophy continues to evolve, responding to new challenges and integrating voices previously unheard. The 20th century's latter half saw philosophy grappling with language in unprecedented ways. The linguistic turn emphasized that many philosophical problems arise from misunderstanding how language functions. Ordinary language philosophers like J.L. Austin and Gilbert Ryle examined how we actually use words in everyday contexts, revealing that philosophical puzzles often dissolve when we recognize category mistakes or speech acts we perform unconsciously. When I say, I promise, I am not describing a mental state but performing an action. The utterance itself constitutes the promise. Similarly, talking about the mind as if it were a ghost in a machine, Ryle argued, commits a category error, confusing dispositional properties with occult entities. Meanwhile, philosophy of mind confronted the hard problem of consciousness. How does subjective experience arise from objective physical processes? Thomas Nagel asked what it is like to be a bat, arguing that subjective experience has an irreducible first-person character that third-person scientific description cannot capture. Frank Jackson's knowledge argument imagined Mary, a scientist who knows everything physical about colour but has lived in a black and white room. When she finally sees red, does she learn something new? If so, physicalism seems incomplete. David Chalmers distinguished easy problems of consciousness, explaining cognitive functions, from the hard problem, why is there subjective experience at all? These questions remain unresolved, bridging philosophy, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. Philosophy of science too underwent transformation. Karl Popper argued that scientific theories cannot be verified, only falsified. Good science makes risky predictions that could prove it wrong. The demarcation between science and pseudoscience lies not in confirmation, but in falsifiability. Thomas Kuhn challenged this orderly picture with his analysis of scientific revolutions. Normal science operates within paradigms, shared frameworks of assumptions, methods, and exemplars. But anomalies accumulate, crises emerge, and revolutionary paradigm shifts occur. Copernican astronomy replacing Ptolemaic, relativity replacing Newtonian mechanics. These shifts are not purely rational, but involve social, psychological, and historical factors. Paul Feyerabend took this further, arguing that scientific method is a myth. Successful science has always involved methodological anarchism, whatever works. His provocative slogan, "Anything goes," challenged the supremacy of scientific rationality. Ethics expanded beyond traditional Western frameworks. Peter Singer applied utilitarian reasoning to animal rights, arguing that the capacity to suffer, not species membership, determines moral status. Speciesism, he claimed, is as arbitrary and indefensible as racism. His effective altruism movement asks how we can do the most good with our resources, sometimes reaching counterintuitive conclusions about charitable giving and career choice. Carol Gilligan challenged the masculine bias in moral development theory, proposing an ethic of care alongside the traditional ethic of justice. Where justice emphasizes impartial rules and individual rights, care emphasizes relationships, context, and responsibility to particular others. This feminist contribution revealed how supposedly universal moral theories often reflected specifically male experiences and priorities. Environmental philosophy emerged as ecological crises intensified. Ananias's deep ecology rejected anthropocentrism, the view that only humans have intrinsic value and nature matters only instrumentally. Instead, all living beings possess inherent worth, and humans should minimize their interference with natural processes. Holmes Rolston. The third argued that ecosystems themselves have value beyond their constituent organisms. Environmental pragmatism, represented by thinkers like Brian Norton, sought practical solutions without requiring consensus on fundamental values. Convergence on policy can occur from diverse philosophical starting points. Climate change has made environmental philosophy urgent, raising questions about intergenerational justice, collective responsibility, and whether liberal individualism can adequately address problems requiring coordinated global action. Political philosophy experienced revival through John Rawls's A Theory of Justice. Rawls proposed a thought experiment. Imagine choosing principles of justice from behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing your position in society, your race, class, gender, talents, or conception of the good. What principles would rational, self-interested people choose? Rawls argued they would choose equal basic liberties and allow inequalities only if they benefit the least advantaged. This social contract theory provided sophisticated defense of liberal egalitarianism. Robert Nozick countered with libertarianism, arguing that justice consists in respecting property rights and voluntary exchanges. Redistribution violates rights even if it reduces inequality. Communitarian critics like Michael Sandel and Alasdair MacIntyre challenged liberalism's atomistic conception of the self, arguing that we are embedded in communities and traditions that shape our identities and values. Identity politics and recognition theory brought new dimensions to political philosophy. Charles Taylor argued that recognition of one's identity is a vital human need. Misrecognition or non-recognition inflicts real harm. The politics of equal dignity seeks uniform treatment, while the politics of difference demands recognition of distinct identities. Nancy Fraser distinguished economic redistribution from cultural recognition, arguing that justice requires both, overcoming material inequality and overcoming status subordination. Kwame Anthony Appiah explored cosmopolitanism, defending both universal moral obligations and the legitimacy of local attachments and identities. We can be rooted in particular communities while recognizing our common humanity and obligations to distant strangers. Critical race theory, emerging from legal scholarship, examined how racism persists structurally, even after explicit discrimination ends. Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw and others analysed how law and institutions perpetuate racial hierarchy. Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality showed how race, gender, class and other identities intersect, creating distinct experiences of oppression that single-axis analyses miss. A black woman faces discrimination different from what black men or white women face. Her experience is not simply additive but involves unique intersectional dynamics. This insight transformed how we think about identity, privilege and justice. Philosophy of technology became increasingly important as digital transformation reshaped human life. Martin Heidegger had warned that modern technology reduces everything to standing reserve, resources to be optimized and exploited, while obscuring other ways of relating to the world. Don Ide and Peter Paul Verbeek developed post-phenomenological approaches, examining how technologies mediate human experience and action, often in ways we barely notice. A thermometer doesn't just report temperature, it transforms our relationship with heat into quantified, precise measurements. Social media doesn't just facilitate communication, it restructures attention, identity performance, and social connection itself. Luciano Floridi proposed information philosophy, arguing that we live in an infosphere, where information technologies raise new questions about privacy, identity, reality, and what it means to be human. Artificial intelligence prompted urgent philosophical questions. Can machines think? John Searle's Chinese room argument claimed that computation alone cannot produce understanding, a person following rules to manipulate Chinese symbols without understanding. Chinese demonstrates that syntax isn't sufficient for semantics. But functionalists argue that understanding consists precisely in the right functional relationships, which machines could in principle instantiate. As AI systems become more sophisticated, questions multiply. If an AI system makes discriminatory decisions, who is responsible? Can AI systems be moral agents? Should advanced AI systems have rights? What happens when AI surpasses human intelligence? These are not merely technical questions, but profound philosophical ones about mind, agency, value, and the future of humanity. Bioethics confronted new possibilities and dilemmas. Genetic engineering, enhancement technologies, life extension, and human cloning raise questions that previous generations never faced. Should we use CRISPR to edit human embryos, eliminating genetic diseases but potentially creating designer babies? Is there a meaningful distinction between therapy and enhancement, or is it arbitrary and culturally contingent? Would radical life extension be good, or would it exacerbate inequality, environmental stress, and social stagnation? Transhumanists like Nick Bostrom argue we should use technology to transcend biological limitations, achieving post-human flourishing. Bioconservatives like Leon Kass worry that such interventions threaten human dignity and the wisdom embedded in natural limits. These debates involve deep questions about human nature, the good life, and whether some things should remain beyond technological control. Philosophy of religion evolved beyond traditional theism and atheism. Religious pluralism acknowledged that multiple religions might contain genuine insight, rather than one being true and others false. John Hick proposed that major religions are different culturally shaped responses to the same transcendent reality. Religious naturalism, represented by thinkers like Loyal Rue and Ursula Goodenough, seeks religious meaning and value without supernatural commitments, finding awe, gratitude, and purpose in the natural world revealed by science. New atheists like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett attacked religion as irrational and harmful, while critics responded that they caricatured sophisticated theology and ignored religion's positive dimensions. Philosophy of religion now engages evolutionary explanations of religious belief, cognitive science of religion, and whether religious experience provides warrant for belief. Metaphysics, supposedly killed by logical positivism, returned with vigour. David Lewis defended modal realism, the view that possible worlds are just as real as the actual world, existing concretely though causally isolated from us. This outrageous-sounding claim supposedly solves problems about modality, counterfactuals, and properties. Ted Sider investigated fundamentality and metaphysical structure. What grounds what? Which entities are basic and which derivative? Debates raged about the nature of time. Does the past exist? Is the future real? Or does only the present exist? Do objects persist through time by enduring wholly present at each moment, or by perduring with temporal parts? These arcane questions connect to physics, cognitive science, and how we understand change and identity. Epistemology addressed social dimensions of knowledge. Feminist epistemologists like Sandra Harding and Helen Longino showed how supposedly objective inquiry reflects social positions and interests. Standpoint theory claimed that marginalized positions can provide epistemic advantages, seeing aspects of social reality obscured from dominant perspectives. Social epistemology, developed by Alvin Goldman and others, studied how knowledge is produced and distributed in communities. Testimony, expertise, scientific institutions. These social processes are essential to knowledge but raise normative questions. Whom should we trust? How do echo chambers and epistemic bubbles distort understanding? How does misinformation spread? In an age of information overload and epistemic polarization, these questions are not merely academic. Eastern philosophy gained recognition in Western academia beyond superficial appropriation. Scholars engaged seriously with Buddhist philosophy's sophisticated analyses of self, consciousness, and causation. The Madhyamaka school's doctrine of emptiness denies that anything exists independently or essentially. Everything is interdependent and conventional. This bears striking resemblance to contemporary metaphysical views about fundamentality and grounding. Yogacara idealism argues that all experience is mental, that subject-object duality is constructed, not given. These views challenge Western assumptions while offering resources for contemporary problems. Confucian ethics of roles and relationships provides alternatives to Western individualism. Taoist spontaneity and non-coercive action resonate with contemporary critiques of instrumental rationality and control. African philosophy, long marginalised, articulated distinctive approaches. Ubuntu philosophy emphasises that a person is a person through other persons. Individual identity is constituted through relationships and community. This contrasts sharply with Western individualism. Kwasi Werdu worked to decolonise African philosophy, showing how African concepts and frameworks can address universal philosophical questions without simply replicating Western categories. Pauline Tonji insisted that African philosophy is not just traditional wisdom, but contemporary critical inquiry by African philosophers. This debate about what counts as African philosophy itself reflects broader questions about universalism and particularity, tradition and modernity. Indigenous philosophies from Native American, Aboriginal Australian, Maori, and countless other traditions offer alternative metaphysics, epistemologies, and ethics. Many indigenous worldviews reject human nature dualism, seeing humans as embedded in networks of relationships with other beings, animals, plants, land, ancestors. Knowledge is not abstract and timeless, but embodied, situated, and relational. These perspectives challenge not just specific Western philosophical claims, but the entire framework of disembodied universal reason. Integrating indigenous voices into philosophy requires more than adding new content. It may require transforming how we do philosophy itself. The digital age brings philosophy to new audiences and forms. Online philosophy communities, podcasts, videos make philosophical ideas accessible beyond academia. But this democratization has costs: superficial engagement, ideological echo chambers, weaponized philosophy in service of politics. Philosophy must navigate between rigor and accessibility, between specialized expertise and public relevance. Perhaps philosophy's future lies not in isolated academics, but in engaged public intellectuals who bring philosophical tools to contemporary problems, not claiming to have answers, but helping us ask better questions, think more clearly, see our assumptions, and imagine alternatives. As we survey this vast landscape, certain patterns emerge. Philosophy moves in cycles. Questions reappear in new forms. Ancient debates resurface with modern vocabulary. Yet there is also genuine progress, not toward final truth, but toward greater sophistication, clearer distinctions, more nuanced understanding. We know better what we don't know. We recognize complexity where our ancestors saw simplicity, ambiguity where they saw clarity. This is not defeat but maturity. Philosophy today is global, diverse, and multifaceted. It addresses ancient questions with new tools and contemporary problems with old wisdom. It spans from abstract metaphysics to urgent practical ethics, from formal logic to phenomenological description, from armchair speculation to engagement with empirical science. Some philosophers work on narrow technical problems, others address broad existential questions. Some seek precision and rigor, others embrace ambiguity and exploration. All participate in humanity's ongoing conversation about what matters most. This endless questioning, this perpetual wondering, this refusal to accept easy answers, this is philosophy's gift to humanity, a gift that remains as vital today as when the first thinkers gazed at the stars and asked why. Philosophy will continue as long as humans possess curiosity, as long as we refuse to accept the world uncritically, as long as we believe that examine life is worth the difficulty. The questions change, the methods evolve, the participants multiply, but the fundamental impulse remains: to understand, to question, to wonder, to seek wisdom even knowing it may forever elude complete possession. In this seeking itself lies philosophy's value and its beauty.